Mitch Horowitz, welcome to the Witch Wave.
I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so happy you're here. As I told you off camera, I have been wanting to have you on this show for literal years. You and I have a long history together. Yeah. But this really feels like a moment of deep alignment in terms of the book that you are here to talk about and this show. So, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just so happy to see you.
It's so great to be here. I mean, people who are viewing this have no idea the depth of our history together.
Exactly.
It goes back to the very beginning.
It really does. And actually, maybe let's jump in on that point, which is the first book that I believe that you wrote, which is the book that introduced us to each other, is Occult America.
Yeah.
And if I'm remembering properly, I think I first met you in person because I was taking a class from you at the Open Center. Right?
Yeah.
I don't think we would have met before that. And I think so. I started as a student
and
a fan of your book. And then I think I had just started probably Observatory with some friends, which is the arts and event space that I co-ran for a little while. And you were an early lecturer there. And then we started doing our Occult New York tours.
Right.
Which was really your Occult New York tour. I mean, like, we go back, my friend.
Well, it was very collaborative, and people loved those Occult New York tours. And I miss them. It's just a question of time and being able to keep up with everything that a person wants to do. But I occasionally will come upon sites where Nikola Tesla lived and think, oh, that would be such a great location for the Occult New York walking tour.
I know.
But
we might have to bring it back
Maybe.
someday.
Could be.
But the reason that I want to establish us in our history and in your roots as a historian is that it feels like you and I also have had an interesting parallel in terms of our lives, where when you, or I should say at the time that you wrote that book and when we first met, you were very much a historian of the occult. You were an editor-in-chief at Tarcher Penguin, one of the best metaphysical imprints in the world. And then you went on to write a lot of books and become a freelance everything that you are. I left my corporate gig to become a freelance, all the things I do. And I couldn't help but notice that a lot of your books became more and more personal, that you shifted from, I won't say just being a scholar, because that's an amazing thing to be, but to really revealing that you were kind of, as the kids say, getting high on your own supply. Like you were practicing magic and doing a lot of the things that you were editing and writing about. So that's a very long preamble. Thank you for your patience. I want to ask you, what made you decide to start writing more personally about your own magical practice and step out of the role of only being a historian and a scholar?
Well, I always saw myself as a believing historian, and in my experience, most religious historians are, in fact, believing historians in that they emerge from the congregations they write about. They don't often cop to that because people fear it's going to give a perception of subjectivity, as if that's not a universal human situation.
Right.
And after I published Occult America, people would not infrequently come up to me and say, what do you believe? Do you believe any of this stuff? And I was surprised because I thought I had indicated a constructive engagement with the idea, but I hadn't perhaps been as clear as I thought I had been. And then I was more personal in my second book, One Simple Idea.
Yes.
One Simple Idea, which was a history of the positive mind movement. And I got pushback for that in some mainstream places like Psychology Today magazine and a very negative review in the Wall Street Journal from a career skeptic. Because I was validating certain ideas about the extra-physical capacities of the mind. And I thought to myself, well, I can accept that. I can accept pushback from the mainstream if I feel I've done a good book. And then in my third book, Miracle Club, which was really my first full-on practical book, I was more forthright. And I'll go back and forth. A book like Modern Occultism is more of a historical book, although I think my point of view certainly comes through in it. But for the new one, Practical Magic, I think writing it was a really cathartic exercise because I gave myself the permission to let my freak flag fly, as they used to
Yes.
say. And it was very helpful. And also, it might be a function of age. I'm 59. And I thought to myself, why would I internalize things that could be helpful to another seeker? So I just decided to be increasingly blunt and upfront. Um, I know a religious scholar, he's still living, um, and he and his wife have a great deal of interest in a particular a channeler, a medium who's
Mhm.
now deceased.
Mhm.
And they're so interested in this woman's work that they took it upon themselves to translate one of her books from French to English just for their own private use. And he said to me at a certain moment, "Don't tell anyone I'm interested in this material."
Mm.
And I said to him, "Look, I value people's privacy. That's fine. But why the hesitancy?" And it was that worry that indicating personal commitment to something, especially something that's still off to the fringes as channeling or mediumship, would sully his career. And I thought to myself, well, if not now, when? If not
Yeah.
now, when? So
Yes.
that drove me, and I just decided to be very free with my personal disclosures.
Yes. I love your new book, Practical
Thank you.
Magic. And as someone who's known you for a fairly long time, I felt this sensation of like freedom and joy on your behalf when I was reading it, because it really felt to me like Mitch is putting all his cards on the motherfucking
Yeah,
table.
yeah.
Like, no apologies. You make some really bold
Mhm,
statements in the book,
mhm.
which, some of which we may get into. But I just felt like I always struggle with the word proud because I'm not your mom.
No, that's quite right.
But I hope you take that in the
I
spirit
appreciate it.
intended. Like, I just felt like proud of you insofar as like I get really happy for people when they're just truly being themselves and letting themselves shine as brightly as they can, and doing the work that I believe they were brought here to do. And
Thank you.
and that's how I felt when I was reading it. I just was so happy for you. So congratulations.
Thank you. I think part of the reasons for my disclosure in the book is that I want those of us who are on the path to feel a sense of freedom about verifying things, about not getting caught up in concepts, no matter how familiar they are, no matter how widely repeated they are. And I have seen within the culture of search, people sometimes feel, or maybe I've felt it for them, that their wish is taken from them because it's considered not spiritual.
Mm.
And they defer to some idea from a translation of a translation of a translation of an ancient text about non-attachment or non-identification, which may be valid, but still warrants verification for the person in the 21st century.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of us get torn apart because we might feel a certain impulse in our lives, an unfulfilled gap, whatever it is, and immediately think to ourselves, even in private, wait, that's not spiritual enough. I didn't say anything about service. And, and I think we as individuals have to permit ourselves the freedom from hand-me-down concepts. So that's
Yeah.
also what I was trying to do.
Yes. So the full title of the book is Practical Magic, Ancient Tradition and Modern Practice. And if I were to describe this book to someone, I would also say that it's a guide for how to do magic from a very distilled, and I don't mean that you've simplified it
Mhm.
in a dismissive way,
Mhm.
but you've really gotten to the heart of magical processes and
Right.
techniques and theories. You also offer a lot of anecdotes, both historical anecdotes and from your own life, of ways in which magical practice has been effective. And
Mhm.
so I would assume that someone could read this book, even if they've never practiced magic before or never thought they were, and feel like, oh, now I can start doing shit, right?
That's my wish. That's
Yeah.
my wish. I over the last several years, I've been very invested in ESP research, and I've
Hmm.
been super interested in the history of ESP research. And we have a body of that research that is so bulletproof, that is so widely replicated. It's sheer politics that it doesn't find its way into Wikipedia.
Yeah.
It's just partisanship. And eventually that's going to start to wind down because with the advent of AI, which hasn't even begun to touch our lives
Oh
yet.
my God, I'm terrified, Mitch.
Oh,
But
it's going to be heavy. I mean,
yeah.
we've only been exposed to like prototypes or beta launches of AI.
Yep.
And likewise, I would say almost none of the public has been exposed to quantum computing, which is just freaky beyond belief.
Yes.
Anyway, my hope is that these things are going to start to distill information in a way that's not so partisan and sentimental, and that results on all this wonderful data we have on the extra-physical capacities of the psyche not being given due recognition. But when you really work with it and you see that the data is there, it reaches a point where you say to yourself, extra-physicality is so warranted a belief. It has been so validated over a course of generations.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have the whole history of testimony from seekers and from within and without the religious traditions. And when you marry that to the contemporary data in psychical research, it's impossible to come away with the impression that the mind or the psyche, I prefer to say, because that is more of an amalgam of mind and emotion,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have some extra physical agency.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur Schopenhauer felt this way, for example. He didn't identify as a religious figure or as an occultist, but he said quite incisively at a very, very early stage of the so-called Enlightenment, this is the agency behind magic. And I felt he was right, although I don't use that to preclude belief in deity, non-human intelligence, and so forth, which is also part of my search.
Right. And you make that clear in the book.
Yeah. And I got to thinking whether magic as we know it, ceremonial magic as it's come down to us from late antiquity, from the Renaissance, at least those of us here in the West, whether ceremonial magic could be simplified, even to the point, and this is sort of my ultimate challenge to myself in the book, even to the point that the well-defined wish could be enough. The impassioned wish could be enough. There's just no question that we are beings who participate in a material and immaterial existence. And the implications of that are astounding.
Yes.
So that's what I was trying to dig at.
Yes. Let's get down to brass tacks here. So you start the book with a quote by Jack Parsons, who, for listeners and viewers, famous occultist, ceremonial magician, rocket scientist, and we're placing him around, it's like early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I think he died in the 50s, if
Yeah.
I'm remembering correctly. And you start the book with a quote saying, "Simplicity has been the key to victory in all the idea wars, and at present, magic does not have it."
Yeah.
And the idea being that ceremonial magic, and maybe we should define those terms for people, but I think he was responding to probably like Aleister Crowley,
Yeah.
who was coming out of a tradition of like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn,
Right.
Freemasonry. I mean, we can like extrapolate this back as far as like John Dee and angel magic, all of this stuff, right?
Exactly.
Where the idea is like you have to memorize the names of angels and you have to do magic at certain hours and there's certain herbs and, colors and that it takes a long time, lots of preparation, robes are involved, though I do love a good robe. But, it's complicated, right?
It's very complicated, yeah.
And so it feels like Jack Parsons with this quote is kind of saying like, it doesn't have to be. Like that stuff is
Right.
cool, but like we need a more simplified version of this. And it feels like that was really the inspiration for this book too.
Absolutely. It's interesting. You mentioned John Dee. And amazingly enough, John Dee wrote a lot of stuff down. And if you go back and read his notes about his magical operations, the level of dedication it's just beyond anything most of us in the 21st century know.
Yeah.
The hours and the preparation and the intensity. And there's no question of the sincerity and the intellectual power behind what he and his collaborators were attempting. And then you move up to closer to our era, and Crowley very heavily walked in those footsteps. Even though Crowley was the great rebel, he was very married to that very thickly liturgical
Yes,
ceremonial
that's what I was
magic.
going to say. Liturgy
Yeah,
and books on books on books of texts and
huge.
incantations. Yeah.
And it's very complex. And Jack Parsons, who for a time was Crowley's protege here in
Mm-hmm.
America,
Mm-hmm.
he was very dedicated to Crowley, and he worked these operations. And then a problematic man named L. Ron Hubbard walked in Jack's front door
Heard of
one
them?
day. Yeah.
Heard of them?
And they become pals for a very, very, very short time until Hubbard stole his girlfriend and ripped him off and
Ain't that
abandoned
the
him.
way?
Yeah, so what you always want from a house guest. and so Jack was destitute. Jack felt that he had vested his confidence in somebody who had just completely betrayed him, and the emotional pain was deep.
Mm-hmm.
Jack had made some very serious progress in his magical pursuits, but he had lost the confidence of Crowley, who, even from a distance, and this was Crowley just before his death, but even from a distance, just via letters being exchanged across the Atlantic, Crowley immediately honed in on Hubbard as a con artist.
Yep.
And Crowley wrote to a colleague of his and said, "These goats are fairly driving me crazy with their naivete. This Hubbard is obviously a troublemaker. What is Jack doing?" And so Crowley was so sharp still in his old age that even by letter he could hone in on what Jack, in his good nature, was unable to. And Crowley really cut Jack loose at that time, even though Jack had been financially supporting him. So he felt alone. He felt very alone. And that's when he started writing things like the quote you just read and began to feel that maybe he believed very deeply in the magical pursuit, but he wasn't sure that it needed to be attached to this tradition of great thickness and density. And I think partly his separation from Crowley involved separating from that liturgical density. And sadly, Jack himself died before he could go deep into this. But I was very inspired when I read that because it's an impulse that I felt myself. I think that's what got me interested, frankly, in New Thought and the positive mind tradition is the sheer wild simplicity of it. And I've always felt that the early New Thought pioneers, they had an instinct for something. They really had an instinct for something. In my estimation, they did a better job at popularizing their movement than at refining their movement, which is why New Thought since the late 19th century has never, for example, developed a theology of suffering. And it's a serious problem. It hasn't grown. But
what do you mean by that theology of suffering?
well, within the New Thought tradition, and this is true within Christian Science as well, there is a denial of suffering as illusion, that the world that we live in is a good world, and that it is only our screwed up, twisted thoughts that ruin it for everybody.
Right.
And so, for example, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, and Miss Eddy was a great metaphysician. I mean, Mrs. Eddy was a great intellect. Mrs. Eddy really tried to inure in her followers the idea that ours is a good world and that it's really just humanity's negative thought streams that create these delusions.
Right. And I know a lot of people then can push that point to its extreme and say, so are you saying then that I'm responsible for giving myself cancer?
Exactly.
Or, like bad shit happens to people. And there are some who think that the positive thinking movement has really placed a lot of blame
Absolutely.
on the, I guess we'd call them victim or the
Right.
person experiencing the suffering.
And
And that's
that-
obviously very problematic.
It's very problematic, and it's a very serious critique with which New Thought as an organized movement has never dealt adequately. And I do not believe that suffering is delusion. I think that suffering is a very real part of life. And it's very easy for me to sit in the United States and say, right on, suffering is delusion.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, tell that to a war victim, tell that to a victim of gang violence, tell that to somebody, who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong
Of
time and a natural
course.
disaster struck.
Of
And
course.
and that's our life too.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt New Thought had a wonderful instinct, and I love the simplicity of New Thought.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something there, but it remained overly attached to this insistent model that suffering is not real, and
Right.
I can't abide that.
So we talked about Crowley already, and he has perhaps one of the most famous definitions of what magic is, which
Yeah.
is magic is I'm quoting Crowley now, magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And Crowley also famously wrote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will." A word keeps coming up there, which is the word will.
Mm.
I know personally this is a word that I've had trouble with when it comes to Crowley's work because I've experienced some people think that this means you could do whatever the fuck you want and that your individual desire is should trump everybody else's, I don't know, feelings or everybody else's life experiences. And some people, I think, use that phraseology to rationalize their own selfishness and sometimes abuse, right? But this is just my reaction to that word, and I'm obviously coming to that word with my own assumptions and so on. In the book, in your book, you talk about will and you talk about desire and how these are real engines of magic.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain this to
Oh,
me
sure.
and to my listeners? Because I would love to have a better understanding of what you mean by it.
I think Crowley is such an interesting case because the message was more refined than the messenger. I think he did lead his life in a very selfish and very hurtful way. And a lot of people, like Israel Regardie, for example, got very hurt by Crowley. And a lot of people whose names are not as widely remembered as Israel's got very hurt by Crowley. There was an aggression about the man that I didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
But he could also rise to beautiful heights. And when he spoke about, my favorite line of his is, "Every man and every woman is a star." It's so
Yes.
simple and it's so beautiful. And he harbored a concept of true will that I think is very similar to such a concept in Nietzsche's way of thought. And that is that within each of us, there is a true self, a primal self that wishes for attainment, for expression. This is my language, not Crowley's, and that will be at ease with everybody else if that expression, if that attainment is not blocked or stymied. Crowley, of course, had a tremendous umbrage against Victorian Christianity and particularly his mother's brand of Victorian Christianity, while still being attached to it. He would do things like refer to his mother as a brainless bigot, but then he would display the same brainless bigotry towards like an Israel Regardie or somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as he was crossed, he could revert to the most conformist attitudes of the Victoriana
Sure.
that he wanted to smash.
Yeah.
But when he was in the right mood, this spirit of nonconformity could really be very resplendent in his work. And it occurred to me that we on the path today, although our times are vastly more licentious and free than Victorian times, or so we like to believe, we on the path today, we encumber one another with so much language about, well, let's say non-identification, non-attachment, needing to process everything through service. You find a lot of that in New Thought. And we perfume our wishes so much and so heavily. And I think it can almost separate us from concepts of what we really want, wish for, would feel happiness over, and sometimes even keep us bound to situations that are very unhealthy. Like I write again and again about the imperative of getting away from cruel people.
Yeah.
I see more people's lives ruined by remaining in, including kids, like adolescents, by remaining in proximity to cruelty that they feel bound to without ever testing those chains. And when you test those chains, you will be very surprised that they're not as strong as you think they are. And the notion that we need to go through all these therapeutic spiritual exercises to deal with a bad mate or a bad neighbor or a bad coworker, I question all of that. I think the imperative may be to get away from that person. And if you really can't get away from that person for any number of reasons, like economic, you can swear within that at the first physical opportunity I have, I am getting away from this person. There's nothing to compromise with there. There's nothing to compromise with amid cruelty.
Right.
And I see people on the path sometimes speaking in terms of personal happiness, for example. And I see that question getting taken from them by somebody who might say, well, you know, what you call happiness is really resistance to blah, blah, you know, or
Right.
something that might have some merit, but that still cancels out what the individual wishes and feels.
Right.
And I tell you, Pam, I mean, here's a funny story, and I'll make it very, very, very quick. We are often told in many different religious traditions, Buddhism, some of the Abrahamic traditions, as well as alternative traditions, that not unlike what Mrs. Eddy was saying, outer life is an illusion. And don't get lost chasing these butterflies. They're fake, they're phony, they're baloney. Don't end up like that guy in the Matrix who's eating the steak. It's all fake. And be that as it may, I think we have to pay attention to those peak moments in our own experience where we feel profoundly relaxed and happy. And I remember I was coming back from a vacation. I was flying into JFK Airport. I was very depressed. I was very unhappy.
JFK will do that.
It just takes the vacation right out of you. And I swore not to check my work email. I was still in publishing, but I check it. And there was a invitation from an NPR producer to come on a show the next day and talk about miracles. And I was thrilled. And I went home that night and bathed the kids and fed them and got them to bed and then started studying up on miracles. And I was so happy and I was so at ease. And the entire gait of my existence shifted. And I thought to myself, don't lose that. Don't just write that off as some meaningless bauble. I feel I was doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
If a bee should be gathering pollen or whatever, I'm supposed to be doing that. And that was helpful for me. That was really helpful.
But this feels to me worth teasing out a little bit, the difference between, you know, what Joseph Campbell would call following your bliss, which is actually a phrase that I know has become trite. It changed my life when I was, you know, probably 19 or whenever it was that I read that passage. You know, this idea that the things that enliven us, that make us feel the most ourselves, the most at ease, to use your words, that's a signal or a sign that we're supposed to keep forward on that path, right? On the other hand, I sometimes worry that when people hear the words will or desire, they can use it to justify gross behavior.
Right. I
and
do
that's
understand.
my own like stigma or my own, you know, connotation, or perhaps I bring my own defensiveness to those words as a woman, you know, all of these different things. And P.S., I love the concept of desire. I often talk about shameless desire. And yet I also know that there are people who will use those words to justify abuse or justify like, oh, well, this is what I want. My will is telling me to, I mean, not to take it to the stupid extreme, but like murder a family.
I hear you. Believe me.
So how do you differentiate between all of these subtleties?
I think that's a wonderful point. One of the things I read a lot about, and I don't think you'll find this anywhere in Crowley, is reciprocity. That life is also reciprocity. Life is relationship. And people talk about karma, but I don't like to use the word karma because I don't like to take terms from another tradition, in this case Vedic tradition, and use it to plug up holes in my own.
And decontextualize it too.
And very decontextualized.
Right.
You know, karma, and there are different concepts of karma throughout Hindu practice, but a lot of classical strains of Hinduism see karma as a very vast process
Yeah.
and one that really can't be tracked in the life of the individual. With apologies to John Lennon, instant karma is not something that we're able to see much of.
Oh, if only it was in
If
certain cases.
if only
There are
it was.
certain people who karma seems very late to the game to
Incredibly late.
Yeah.
Incredibly late. And it can be very frustrating to those of us
Yes.
who wish for a sense of balance and justice.
Justice.
And I do speak in terms of reciprocity. I am probably closer in nature to what Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about in his essay Compensation. And Emerson, and this is very controversial for a lot of people, he believed that life is compensatory and that suffering is rewarded in the here and now, not in the afterlife, by other leavenings. And that is an idea that must be wrestled with, because a sensitive person should want to argue with that idea. A sensitive person should want to push back at that idea. There are cases to say, wait a minute, what about this or what about that? And I believe in that. And I want to push back against it. I'm haunted by Emerson because I know he's right, and yet I also know there's suffering and there's tragedy that is not compensated for in this life.
Sure.
And that's tragic and it's unfair and it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I do believe that the individual is bound by nature in relationships. And I do believe in reciprocity. And my ethic on the path is that I would never do anything to disrupt another person's reach for potential, however he or she defines it. And I would expect the same in return.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly do not have a right to intrude upon another person's existence, violate their wishes, their safety, their needs. And if I'm doing that, then I'm wrong. I've failed.
Yeah.
And I do believe I will suffer for that. I do believe I will suffer. So I feel very, very strongly that a sense of honor, loyalty, solidarity, plain dealing, reciprocity must be present in life. One way that I have found that has been helpful to bring that into my life, if I've succeeded, is I think many of us foster too many relationships. It's almost overwhelming. On social media, for example, we come into contact with more people in a day than the ancients would have come into contact with possibly in their whole lives. And it's very possibly true. And I think that there's so much emotional violence on social media. We as civilization are so not ready for it, but here it is.
Yeah.
And, here comes quantum computing and here comes AI.
Yeah.
And we're not up to it. We're not up to it. And so I try to keep it really chill in terms of my family circle. I sometimes joke that I have no friends. I'm not so sure that's a joke, I mean, I'm not averse to people. I mean, like, this exchange is wonderful for me, but I have found that people sometimes will talk about subtle insults and cut downs, and very often these things are coming from friends, family, coworker, people who are supposed to be there to absorb the shocks of life, not to provide them. And so my existence has become a quieter existence in terms of my social contacts. And I try within those social contacts to practice what I've been describing.
Interesting. My experience of you, to talk personally, is that you have a very strong ethic. You have been nothing but supportive and generous toward me, toward my sister, who's also a writer and a very spiritual person. And so I certainly don't mean to imply that your practice of exercising your will or your desire is in any way
not at
harmful.
all. Not at all.
And you do make it very clear in the book that empathy and ethics are important to you. You say that early on in the book. It's just something that I wrestle with in these conversations, and when I'm reading not just your work but everybody's work, where I'm like, I trust you, Mitch, but I'm worried about someone reading your book and being like, oh, Mitch says that
Right.
I should just do whatever the fuck I want.
I can take your car.
Exactly,
So,
right?
right.
And I guess it's not a fair position to put you in because there are bad actors who can people take the Bible and use it to justify all kinds of terrible things, right? Not that it's a perfect document by any stretch. But you know what I'm saying? But I guess just because you're here, you're in front of me, it's just something that I wanted to...
I think that the chief way that I grok to the idea of will is through self-expression. My wish is...
See, I like that. That feels better in my body, self-expression.
Yeah. And I think that if I could come up with any formula to life that certainly has made me happy, it's self-expression. Feeling at ease in that way. Like, for example, I've spent 27 years in corporate publishing. You were there front and center.
Yeah.
And good things come from that. You get benefits, you get a salary, you get somebody to, fix the paper jam in the printer and so forth. A lot of good things.
Yeah.
I was also unhappy during a lot of that time, not because I was unhappy working on other people's projects, but because I didn't feel other people, both writers and the vast support staff that publishing used to represent, I didn't think people were doing their best work necessarily. I saw lots of people who I thought were not paying attention, not really taking the care to work hard. I calculated at one point that I spent probably 20% of my job just correcting careless mistakes, and that was not happy for me. Now, today I get up in the morning, I bound out of bed. Bound out of bed. And I work constantly. I mean, it never stops.
Yes.
It never stops. And yet I'm happy because I'm in expression. We're doing this. And that'll be different for all kinds of people.
Sure.
And I have to watch my own prejudices about that because I could see somebody from what might be considered a very mainstream walk of life. But for that person, what they're doing really means something.
Yeah. So do you think that magic is a means to attain happiness?
Yes, I do.
Wow. Really?
I feel that the word happiness has become verboten within intellectual circles, certainly on the path. I mean, I've been in intellectual circles where, if you utter the word happiness, you're on kitchen duty for 6 weeks, and that's it, if not latrine duty. And at the end of the day, I feel like happiness is a valid goal.
Same, 100% same.
And I see magic as a way of expressing one's agency in the world, which I presume would lead to happiness, whatever it is that the person might be directed toward doing. And we here in the modern West, of course, are in a hell of an advantageous position. And I have to remind myself about that too, because we, of course, New Thought grew in America. This is the nation of the stock market and mass consumer goods. And look, most of the time, most people in this country are physically safe, which people around the world do not have. And so on that note, I try to remember that as well. I also think there's an ethic in that, because damn me if I'm complaining about how long I'm kept on hold at, AT&T or damn me if that's the biggest problem I have in my day. So I try to keep that front and center.
Okay. I'm looking at my notes here because I want to get exactly the quote that you write in here, which is you talk about the clarity of self and wishes. And it seems to me like if your book has any thesis statement, it's the fact that you need to be radically honest with yourself about what you want, and that is the catalyst, if you will, for powerful magic. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I think that's another thing that I sometimes struggle with, because in my practice as a witch, sometimes I'm very specific about what I want, but sometimes I cast a spell of intent, but I'm not telling spirit how to do it.
Yeah.
In other words, I know some people, they'll be like, I want that job, and I will cast a spell to get that job. I want to be, I don't know, I'll just president of
United States.
Schmeckelman Shoe Company.
Right.
I don't know. Right? And then maybe that spell happens and they're really unhappy. Like, I don't always know that what I fantasize about is necessarily the path to happiness, right? And so my spellcraft has shifted a lot to be like, please, spirit, please, goddess, help me live a life of joy. And I do say service, Mitch, and I'm going to challenge you on that.
I've been challenged. Shetzar challenges me on that, the artist. Yeah.
Okay. And magic, creativity, love, and it sometimes gets more specific than that for sure. But rather than say, like, I want that house, it's like, please, spirit, can you help me find a house where I will feel secure?
Yeah.
And maybe it has a bathtub too. And maybe it has some of these features, but then let spirit figure out what it looks like. And in my experience, things have happened to me in my life that are more amazing than I could have even dreamed for myself.
Yes.
So I wonder how you thread the needle between being as specific as possible versus also being open to spontaneity and surprise and maybe the idea that we don't always know what's best for us.
I totally grok to that. I think that this is where I come down. The wish needs to be radically honest, and I think private, unless you really have somebody in whom you can confide. I think there's if a person wants to obey an occult law, the law of silence is one to obey. We very often talk about things to dilute or disperse them. Like if we feel badly about something, we might talk to somebody about it, and there's a place for that. But talking is dilution, and that can be very helpful, but you don't want to do that with your innermost wish. Reach the wish, but be flexible and be allowing of different ways for it to reach you. Like one of the things I write about in the book is that I personally believe, and I've observed this in my own life, that a person may receive exactly what he or she needs or wants or whatever, but it might come in a very unusual way and hence get dismissed, or it might come in a very mundane way and because it seems mundane get dismissed, or because it violates one of my orthodoxies. I might ask for some sort of like therapeutic or cathartic help with something, and look, it might come in the form of a pill. And if I say, well, I don't take pills, that's going to avert my good. And Wallace Wattles, the New Thought writer who wrote Science of Getting Rich, who's a very beautiful man.
Such a great name.
Died very young, a lovely man. Died at a socialist colony in the state of Tennessee, as a matter of fact. He got tuberculosis and died while he was visiting. And his book was called Science of Being Well. And I don't throw out Wallace's stuff, but I would contend that the law of mind is not the only game in town. And that's how I feel, towards New Thought. So but I love the man, and he was a beautiful man. And he wrote in Science of Getting Rich, things are going to reach you through established channels first. So if you want a house is not just going to spring up from the ground. There are established channels, and you have to watch very carefully.
Right.
And there are also just weird channels, things that really come sideways, and they will hit you sideways.
Yes.
And you will think, I didn't get my wish. And it's like, you may have gotten your wish in aces, but you haven't paid attention to the fact that it came in a very sideways manner. And so that's my approach. I won't focus on, it must come this way or it must be that job. And we all know people, and we've all engaged in this ourselves of like, that's the job. That must happen.
Right.
And those instincts are very rarely correct because there's a lot of stuff going down. Or it's like love and romance. People are just certain that's the only person for me. And I can't dissuade myself, much less anybody else, from thinking that way. Love has its own rules. So just let it work its way on you because it's like holding back the ocean. But bear in mind that the likelihood is you're going to get what you need, but it may come very sideways.
Yeah. I want to talk about, I know you just said keeping your wishes silent is important.
I break
but
that rule
you
all
do,
the time.
and you break,
because
you
I have a reason
broke
to
the
break it.
rule
Yeah.
in the book insofar as you told us about 2 wishes that you had.
That's right.
Are you comfortable talking about past wishes
I'll talk
since
about
they've manifested
even
already?
present ones.
Okay.
I break my own rule for this reason, which is that I firmly
Mitch, oh my God, I'm getting such a kick out of this. Yes.
I think that we on the path who write and speak need to be as blunt as possible so that a person won't feel let down or
Alone?
disappointed or alone. I mean, I did this streaming New Age talk show for a couple of seasons called One Simple Idea. And I interviewed some people in the New Thought tradition, including a few who are very famous. And I know personally that some of these people off camera have problems with rage, with anxiety. They can't tie their own shoelaces. And yet on camera, they're like, just filled with homily after homily after homily. And how much more would it serve the search, to be frank, to say like, I have a problem with rage, or I have a problem with addiction, or, I smoke pot every night to get to sleep, which I do. But, because I want people to not feel that like, oh, how can I ever do that? And it's like, yo, I'm seated right next to you in the lifeboat, right next to you. That's why I will break that rule.
Right. So off the back of that, you talk about a couple of your wishes, one of which was to become a writer.
Right.
And I love this anecdote. And I'd love for you to share the anecdote of you making this wish. Would you call it casting a spell? Or
Oh, I would definitely call it that. Yeah.
To become a writer.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to explain that in the context of what you call, and let me get this right, anarchic magic.
Anarchic magic.
Yeah.
Anarchic magic for me is enacting the spell wherever you are at whatever moment. Propriety be damned.
It's the opposite of ceremonial magic.
Exactly.
It's just do it when it strikes you.
Immediately so. And I mean propriety be damned. And this particular episode, and no one was around, so I didn't have to embarrass myself or anything, but I've never really embarrassed myself. I mean, you'll find me praying in the New York Public Library if I feel like it.
Hey, I go to the Met and I pray, so I understand. Diana, she's my girl.
Exactly.
We've got a connection.
Exactly.
Yep, American Wing.
That's right. That's right. And I was walking along the banks of the Charles River in Weston, Massachusetts, and there are some speculative historians who believe that Vikings settled the bank of the Charles in like the year 1000 AD.
Okay.
Possible. And in the late, I don't know, maybe around 1898, somebody erected a tower at this particular spot called Norumbega Tower, which was supposed to be the marker for a Viking settlement. And this tower can be climbed up, but there's bars in the windows and everything to keep the, metal heads out and everything. But I squeezed through the bars, and sure enough, there's the metal heads, the Hail Satan and the beer bottles and everything. And I was like, okay, you kids got in too. And I climbed to the top, and it was like a cold, chilly winter day. And I suppose you could say I released a wish. I released a wish that I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be an author, and I wanted to be published, and I wanted to be out there in the world.
Can I ask how old you were?
I was about 40 at that time.
Okay.
And I was moving in that direction, but I was nowhere. I was still a few years away from having published Occult America.
So still working for a corporate.
Without
for
question.
Penguin. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I wanted it with all my guts. I mean, Pam, with all my guts, like physical, mental, extra physical,
cellular level,
everything. Yeah.
Yes.
And I released it, and I felt I proceeded along a tough but very steady path thereafter. And it wasn't that much longer from that time. Maybe it was 3.5 years that Occult America came out. And it was very meaningful to me. It was very meaningful to me. I've done this in hotel lobbies. I've done this in museums. I've done this in front of a bas relief of Mercury downtown.
Yes.
And I think when the
spirit strikes
you, do that spell, do that prayer, do that wish, whatever you call your operation. Don't wait, because those emotions are valuable.
Yes. And so it feels like when you're saying the word anarchic, you just mean fuck the rules,
Yes,
basically?
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Fuck
Okay.
the rules. Like some people will say to me, isn't that the same as chaos magic? And it's a cousin. It's a cousin to
A
chaos.
cousin to chaos. I love it.
Some people in
That's
chaos.
going to be our death metal band, by
That's
the way,
right, cousin
Mitch.
to You know what? That's actually really good. Some people in chaos are actually materialists. They have no spiritual beliefs, and I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in hacking, the code, introducing an exotic bit of matter into the neighborhood and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
My system is a spiritual system, and it's very free flowing. I mean, I want people to. It's not childish, but it can be childlike, and I want people to make things up like right there. And I think we were all very good at this as kids, and it gets kind of bled out of us through peer pressure.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, do you want to talk about Satanism?
Of course. Always.
I thought you would. I thought you would. This is another area where I get a little tense in my body.
Yeah.
And I had the band, oh my gosh, why did their name just fly out of my head? Twin Temple.
Oh.
I love Twin Temple. Fabulous band. I don't know if you know them, but they call themselves Satanists as well. Uh-huh. They've been on the show. I adore them. They explained to me why they are Satanists.
Yeah.
I get it.
Right.
And also I get so nervous about this because I'm like, Mitch, I'm out here calling myself a witch. And I'm already pushing a boulder up a hill. And especially, we talk, you alluded before to your privilege or our privilege and safety and all these things. Christian nationalism is on the rise.
Yes.
We see who's in charge of the administration right now. Mm-hmm. We see the agenda they're pushing. And so I understand that there are people who call themselves Satanists from a very mythopoetic and literary point of view. Mm-hmm. My understanding is this is a movement of people who see Lucifer from the literary standpoint as a radical and a rebel, right?
Yes.
Is that how you would qualify it?
Right. Romantic Satanism. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much to unpack there, and I'm going to be very quick about it because I know we have finite time, but I'm also going to be very direct.
Okay.
My way of doing things is to go all the way. I sort of dive into the deep end of the pool. Let's see if I can swim. Yeah. I guess we'll find out. And I think, it's funny, I guess this is the heart and the ethos of anarchic magic. I really try things.
Yeah.
And in 2017, I was unhappy. I was lost. And I encountered a book by Carl Abrahamson called Occult, and he had a chapter in there on Anton LaVey, who I didn't even include in Occult America because I thought, Anton's a carny, whatever. I was wrong. There's much greater depth there than I had understood, and Carl brought me to that. And I resonated with this nether energy. I resonated with this fuck the rules energy. I resonated with this anarchic energy. And of course, I thought to myself, if you use the term Satan, you're going to be causing problems for yourself because that's a term that will never be digested in the Western world. It's just, that's not going to happen. So charged. I remember Jacqueline said to me in a minor domestic kerfuffle about a year ago,
your partner.
You're not going to convert the whole Western world to Satanism. And so it's granted. But
Point taken.
I chose to embrace the word because I tend to really, do I honor ancestors? I really honor ancestors. I've made a habit of using hot button terms like occult, ESP, New Age, freely inviting people to apply those terms to myself because I don't want to cede them to the critics. And I began to do a very deep reading of the earliest vestiges of our Western concept of the satanic. Mm-hmm. Most of it is in very, very early Hebrew scripture. Mm-hmm. And I felt there was a deeper, more esoteric reading that could be made there. And I felt the Romantics did a good job of that. I felt William Blake and Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron in particular did a really good job of that. And I resonated with it. I liked it. It felt right in my body in a certain sense. I also, and I suppose I can tell this to you, I've never said this before, and it shouldn't in any way compromise the sincerity with which I describe all of this, but if there's any unspoken motive, if there's any subtext, it's that I like providing room for people to use a term like witch, for example, by saying, well, at least they're not one of them, you know. And I've had places that I've been kicked out of where people who might consider themselves astrologers or mystics or, you know, people that are not necessarily embraced within mainstream religious culture slam the door shut on my fingers. And it hurts. It hurts. And it's terrible to feel misunderstood. But at the same time, it does create a social space so that there's less heat on them. That's not why I'm doing it, but there is a particle of that in there as well.
Yeah. And I totally respect it, and I intellectually understand it. I support you as a friend.
Yeah.
And I'm also like, Mitch, be careful, man.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like I have that feeling, and it's my own also feeling of like self-protection, I think, too.
I do recognize that.
Yeah,
I really do. The only way I think I protect myself, and we'll see how this goes, by dropping the sword and shield in the sense that I am totally transparent. And I will get shit. I mean, I don't want to give any indication.
And you call
to the
yourself
contrary.
a romantic Satanist?
A
Is
romantic
that the right
Satanist.
Identifier? Okay.
Yes. Although, you know, I would say Satanist, you know, it's like if I say Reform Jew, you know, it's the same thing. So
and you prefer that to Luciferian.
I do.
Okay.
What is it? Duncan Trussell said to me once, Lucifer is diet Satan. So, but listen, Lucifer, Satan.
The Coke Zero of
right,
Satan.
exactly.
I like it.
I won't get hung up on any of those terms. But I really won't get hung up on those terms. And I also respect that some people, they find differences within those terms, and I will respect those differences. Those aren't mine, you know.
Okay.
So I try to be historically grounded. I try to be very transparent with people. I am surprised at the lack of shit that I get sometimes. One night I went on Coast to Coast AM, not a redoubt of progressive politics, and I spoke of being a Satanist. I didn't get any hate at all, and I was very touched by that because I felt that the readers really could have, listeners really could have laid into me, and they did not. I get more shit when I talk about Illuminati and so forth, even though that can be historically grounded and understood. That really triggers people. And listen, I've paid prices. I've lost income, and these are only things that I know about.
Yeah.
There may be things I don't know about, and I do recognize how provocative that term is, and I don't, of course, mean it to be provocative. I'm trying to be frank. I'm trying to be upfront. The original Hebrew Hasatan, and which means the Satan, and listening to the cantor intone the name of Azazel during Yom Kippur, that feels right in the body for me. So I went there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And just to be very clear, I'm just covering both our asses.
Yeah.
Mitch, you do not worship the devil in terms of like you're not out here drinking blood and like you don't want to kill children.
No.
Like all and I feel like I have to qualify that about being a witch sometimes too, but I just want to go on the public record of that you mean this in a mythopoetic way.
Oh, absolutely. I do. I'm very interested in Satan as the romanticists saw him, and I think correctly, as a figure of just rebellion, usurpation, nonconformity, emancipation, radical self-expression.
You connect him to Prometheus in the book.
Oh, without question.
Yeah,
Prometheus.
Which I think is very, very beautiful.
As is so frequently the case with the ancients, these terms for them were more neutral than they are for us. Demon in the original Greek was a spirit, like a genie.
Sure.
It was neutral. Satan or Hasatan, I'm not going to say it was a feel-good term, but it didn't connote maleficence or violence or evil, just like Azazel did not. And my practice is a practice of absolute reciprocity, nonviolence, other than warranted self-defense. And there's nothing further from my mind than violating or harming another. Quite the opposite. I want to bring another into a sense of his or her power.
Yeah.
And that's my wish.
Yes. Well, that is not a path I can walk down with you. I can give you galoshes for your hooves so they don't get exactly and say, bless you, have fun on the path, Mitch.
Right.
But I did want to give you an opportunity to talk
I
about
appreciate
it.
that.
And you do write about it in the book with a lot of care.
And the Satanic Panic was such a grim
And
episode.
I'm scared of it happening again.
I'm scared of it happening again. I mean, Damon Eccles, a mutual friend, spent a decade of his life on death row for utterly false accusations,
Exactly.
which he has been cleared of and which DNA testing soon will go the further distance into clearing him of, right? And I think the Satanic Panic was such an awful, spasmodic episode in our history. I had naively thought, oh, that's been so discredited that no one will possibly apply such shibboleths to me.
Right.
I was wrong.
Well, and then, I mean, you think about Pizzagate and you think about,
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, from my point of view, like the witch craze and everything, like people like to be assholes and use
That's right.
these quote unquote dark archetypes to justify
And the
really
witch craze
harming innocent
has
people.
continued.
Right. Of course. You
it's
write about that
yeah,
really beautifully.
And that's so important. I want to tell you a funny story that I've never publicly disclosed before. I'm no longer friends with Steve Bannon, but we were friends at one time because he reached out to me after Occult America was published, and he said to me, you might not know who I am. I'm a conservative documentarian and financier, and I had no idea. And I said, why are you interested in my stuff? And we became friendly, never talked politics, but he was very interested in these subjects. And after the election denialism and stuff, I couldn't stay in proximity to Steve, so we're not friendly anymore. We haven't been in touch in years. But when Trump was first elected, he and I worked in touch quite a bit,
Oof.
Steve and I. And I tried to do something, and I failed. I tried to put I tried to put prioritizing laws, international anti-hate laws, to protect accused witches on the agenda. And I wrote to Steve about this, and I failed. But, for people who wonder, what's going on, behind those doors, I was trying to do something, that I felt was positive and failed at it, but you make an effort, and one should never hang on to relationships as an end to themselves.
And also,
move on.
you said early that cutting cruel people out of your life is very important.
Yeah.
And I'll just say from my standpoint, I'm happy to see that in this case.
You and Steve aren't doing a timeshare this summer? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, to say the very least.
Jersey Shore?
Exactly. I want to talk to you perhaps about a little bit of a lighter topic, but I feel like it's relevant. You write in the book in a way that I actually find quite moving about clothing. About your leather jacket. About how dressing as a kind of what I would call glamour magic.
Yeah, that's a good term.
How and I would say this is an extension of self-expression, which you talked about earlier. How that is something that you don't see as like superficial or frivolous, and how it's really been something you've been mindful about in terms of how you're adorning yourself. And it's something I think about as well when I'm getting dressed and presenting myself. And,
It is so important. I can't be expressive enough. And I emphasize this because it's largely within the hands of the individual. And those kinds of things are really valuable to me. When it's so funny, Pam, the places you get lessons from. If you knew my reading list, I was reading autobiography of Peter Criss, the first drummer for Kiss.
Okay.
And it's very good. And Peter sent me a letter, and I was like, I died. And I'm just living on adrenaline. And anyway, he made the observation. He said, we were together as a band, and we were sort of like a hard rock band, like a million other hard rock bands, and we weren't really getting anywhere. And we saw the New York Dolls, the early punk band, David Johansen, we just lost.
R.I.P.
And he said, we looked at the Dolls and we said to ourselves, can we do that on an arena scale? And he said, we also were looking at gay leather culture in the West Village. And he said, the Dolls and the gay leather culture in the West Village, and what's the Japanese theatrical form?
Buto?
where they wear the facial
Kabuki?
paint. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And he said, we got this crazy idea to marry all this stuff together. And he said, not only at that juncture did we gel as a band, but we gelled as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that Gene Simmons, the infamous Gene Simmons, came up to him.
Indeed, yes.
And he said to him at like a sensitive moment, he said, if I had my way, I would wear this makeup all the time because it's what I feel is actually truly me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel comfortable. I feel at home. And Peter wrote that, you really shouldn't take that for granted. We call it costume, theatricality, but it made us feel like ourselves.
Yes.
And I was very turned on by that. And I was saying earlier that sometimes people will get an idea taken from them on the path. And one of those ideas is that, and very, very basic to Abrahamic tradition, it's what's inside that counts. Don't pay attention to the outside. And there's an ethic to that, and I understand that ethic. But that outside and inside, are they separate? Are they different? Personality, essence, these divisions that we get into, inner, outer. Is anything really separate? It's all one whole, it seems to me. And it's within the power of the individual to act on that. And I have found it tremendously transformative and helpful. And I've followed that thread, and I've come to feel that there's something very important there because we take these expressions from antiquity, we repeat them so frequently that they become catechism, and they work against us in that we forget that there's a wholeness. There is a wholeness, which to me is at the heart of chaos magic, for example. That one little exotic matter can leaven everything, can change everything, and that can be dress.
Mm-hmm. Well, earlier I shared with you that I dressed very intentionally for our conversation. I have 2 Mercury amulets on my neck in honor of you because when you and I used to do the Occult walking tour, we would walk by Grand Central Station, and you taught our group to always say, "Hail Mercury."
Still do that.
Yes, I do too, Mitch, and I actually write about that and you in my book.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah,
Sweet.
because Mercury is kind of the guiding spirit of the book, and we'll talk about that offline. And I also wore this shirt because it felt kind of Twin Peaksy to me.
Yes.
And I know that David Lynch is someone who meant a lot to you. You worked with him.
Yeah.
I know this is opening a whole large vista of conversation that we don't have a lot of time for, but I did want to ask about working with David Lynch. You edited his book, Catching the Big Fish. You've also had some beautiful conversations that people can go and find online between him and yourself. And I guess I just wanted to invite you to comment on what it was like to know him and how you're feeling now that he has I'll say crossed the curtain in his honor rather than crossed the veil.
Right. I mean, it was the privilege of a lifetime. He is such a mystery and yet also was a very warm man, a man who you didn't trifle with, you didn't waste his time, he didn't waste yours. And I wanted to mention 2 things that he had observed that I thought would be helpful. One of them may be apropos of what we're talking about magic and spontaneity. He said that the artist, whatever that person's medium, whatever they do, you got to have the tools of your craft at hand. If you're a painter, you got to have those paints. You got to have the canvases stretched. If you're a writer, write something down. And he always made a point of saying that nothing is more tragic than an ideal lost. If you don't write it down, if you don't get down to business, and make sure that you've recorded that dream or whatever it is, you're going to feel a terrible sorrow. And he was inspired by a painter called Henri Nouwen, who wrote a book called The Art Life. And he said that in The Art Life, Nouwen makes this point that you've got to have all your stuff at the ready. And it can be very hard for people. I mean, having kids and preparing for a busy day. It's terribly hard. But he felt that that's the burden that the artist has to face.
Yes.
And another thing I noticed, and he never said this, but you'll see it between the lines in his book, Catching the Big Fish. He, as a child, was very, very educated in working with his hands. There was hunting and fishing and trapping and cooking and crafts and woodwork and his ability to do the amazing things that he did, not only on screen but in terms of painting and furniture design and other things, grew from that childhood of working with his hands. He never said that, but I see that in the book. And P.D. Uspensky, who was Gurdjieff's student, he made the observation that so many people, and again, you find this on the path all the time, they walk around with these beautiful dreams, but they have no way of expressing these dreams. They don't have that skill, craft honed in the body or wherever it may be. And the work, and you know this, the work and the sweat equity that a person has to put in is so intense. But do it, because you'll get better and better at it. I'm a better writer today than I was a year ago. I write faster. I write more cleanly. I'm happier with my writing. And it only comes from just nonstop sweat equity. And David, he had that growing up. We don't all have that growing up.
Sure.
But he had that growing up. And that's a very important key to his genius, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, that book was and continues to be so influential on me. I love his films, but I have to say that book has probably impacted my life even more than his films. And the fact that you were a steward of it is just, I mean, your own books are such gifts, and so many of the books that you worked on, especially that one, is such a gift to the world, Mitch. Truly, truly.
Thank you.
Well, I have like 15 more questions we didn't get to. I hope we can continue the conversation in many other forms.
You know it. You know it.
And before we go, I know people are going to want to know how to get in touch with you. How can they find out about your talks, your teachings, your books? What's the best place for them to find out about all that?
Well, I finally updated my website, mitchhorowitz.com, and everyone knows how.
I think that is a spell. Every time I update my website, I'm not kidding, new opportunities come
That's fascinating.
through. Yeah. So
it's
there
the hardest
you go.
thing to do. It's
Such a
always
pain
last.
In the ass.
The website.
It's such a pain in the ass.
God.
Yes.
So website is mitchhorowitz.com. X is at Mitch Horowitz. Instagram is at Mitch Horowitz 23. And I always say this, we talked about transparency. If people go to my website, that's my real email on there, and you can write me anything you want. It's the same email the power company uses. So if you're happy, you can tell me that. If you're, and I do that, apropos of I want people to feel that we're kind of in this together. And even though there are controversial aspects to my career, I don't put myself out of reach. And anybody who has got anything on their mind, please do try to be brief is all I ask.
Polite even.
Polite. Well, whether you're rude or not, just be brief.
Amazing.
So I make myself available.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the new book is wherever you buy them.
Yeah.
It's going to be out March 25th, audio, digital, paperback. And, I keep going.
Yes, you do. Well, Mitch, I am so grateful for your friendship and your magic. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a pleasure.